I have noticed that when people talk about The Sopranos and they talk about Tony Soprano, they oftentimes say that Tony Soprano is like some kind of sociopath or psychopath, right? And the actual diagnosis is not really important here. What matters is what they mean by the diagnosis, right? And what the diagnosis that these fans give Tony, usually what they're trying to get at is that he has no empathy. He is not remorseful. He is, a cold-blooded killer, right? And when I saw these comments like early into my like viewing of The Sopranos, I was like, oh, maybe, Tony gets really intense. I saw people say like, oh, after like season 4, things go so off the rails. Tony's so fucked up, yada, yada, yada. But like, I'm at season 6 right now. I don't think that's true. And I wanted to actually talk about why I think that that perspective of The Sopranos and that perspective of Tony actually misses a really important part of The Sopranos, right? Which is that, like, these men are, like, societal rejects, right? People tend to, like, kind of, poke a little bit at the way in which, like, Tony talks about being Italian and the way in which, like, he really seems to think he's oppressed for being Italian. But it's, like, really important to remember that, like, Tony, I think specifically, is only, like, 2 generations out from being an immigrant. I think his grandmother was an immigrant, if not his great-grandmother, right? And the criminality that exists like within his community and that he participates in is a direct result of their experience as immigrants, right? It is the direct result of the fact that they came to this country, they did not have much, they were, outcast by society, and they had to make their own way. And even though this way of living, this criminality, is something that has led to like, a kind of individual prosperity for some of the people within the gang. And, to a certain extent, maybe they see it as like a prosperity for their broader community. It does not erase the fact that a lot of these men feel trapped by the world in which they live, by the world in which they are forced to operate, right? The mob world is very cruel. Once you're involved forever. And throughout the story, we see like a plethora of characters really struggle with what that means for them, right? I think the perfect example of this is Jackie Jr., right? Jackie Jr. is someone who, like, we know his father was the boss before Tony, but like once his father dies and, before his father's death, he was never really that involved. And, in season 2 or 3, I think, Jackie Jr. finds himself at the stage of his life where he feels quite aimless. He doesn't really know what to do with himself. And so he decides to dabble in this, criminality, right? He decides to try his hand at being in the mob. And it goes horribly for him. And it results in his death, right? And throughout this, journey for Jackie Jr., Tony is there. He is telling Jackie Jr., you should not be doing this. This is not the smart thing to do. And a huge part of why Tony says this to Jackie Jr., why he cautions him against this, is because Tony understands that once Jackie Jr. really becomes part of this shit, Tony has to treat him like he treats everyone else, as an employee. And what that means is that when Jackie Jr. super fucks up, right, because the stakes are fucking high in this shit, Tony is no longer able to interact with Jackie Jr. as, nephew and uncle. He must now interact with him as boss and member in the mob, as boss and underling. And that's what happens, right? Tony ends up having to call a hit on him because Jackie Jr. does some shit that is that fucking serious that, it needs to, a life must be taken, blood for blood. That is the laws of this game. And even though Tony has moments where he's having a lot of fun, even though, he enjoys his mistresses, even though he enjoys stealing, a lot of wine with Chrissy every now and then, even though maybe he enjoys, killing people, right? Tony is not fully happy with the situation that he is in. That is why he needs to go to therapy. I saw someone say that, the therapy never worked for Tony, that therapy never works for people like Tony because Tony is, this conniving person and he is going to take this therapy and use it not to actually improve himself, but to harm others. And I have a few issues with this idea because one, we never actually see Tony use what he has learned in therapy to hurt others. At least where I'm at in season 6, early season 6, we actually see quite the opposite. When people come to Tony and they are showing signs of intense emotional distress, right? And it's outside of a context where Tony's like, I might have to kill you over this shit. Tony says to them, oh, maybe you should go see someone. He becomes much more open and willing to talking about, the kind of emotional struggles that the men who surround him may have. Is he perfect? No, he's a 40 to 50 something year old, Italian man from New Jersey. But it's not like he's using what he's learned in therapy to make Carmela's life a living nightmare, right? He's not using what he's learned in therapy to coerce and subjugate others, right? The things he uses to coerce and subjugate others, he has learned outside of therapy. The other reason why I don't like this line of thinking, though, is because Tony is in therapy in the first place because he cannot fully handle the shit that he has to do in his life. This man has routine panic attacks, and he has panic attacks over things that, like, ideally in the world that he's in, he wouldn't have panic attacks over, right? He has panic attacks over his mother being cruel to him. He has panic attacks over ducks flying away. He has panic attacks when he thinks about, the people in his life and like the friends that he's hurt and the friends who he has to kill. Before Tony has to kill someone that he is known for a good chunk of his life, he has these dream sequences, right? Where he's essentially like experiencing the grief of killing this person before he actually ends up killing them. You see it with Pussy and you see it with Tony B, right? Tony, when it comes time to actually kill Pussy and Tony B, right, he is very calm, collected. He does it swiftly, and he doesn't seem to really dwell on it too much, right, post the event. Especially with Pussy, Tony's attitude towards Pussy being a rat completely changes after he has the dream sequence with Pussy in it, right? But the thing is that deep down, Tony is so upset. It makes him so sad that this has to happen. And he wishes that there was another way. But he knows that there is no other way. And he also knows that if he's going to be here, because he can't get out, and so he wants to keep living, if he's going to be here, he has to lock the fuck in, right? He has to take it on the fucking chin, and he has to be as calm, collected about it as possible. So the only way that he really can experience that grief is in a dream, right? Is in a time when he's asleep, when no one is going to be peering into him and looking at what he's thinking about and seeing his emotions. I also want to talk about the fact that a lot of the emotional outbursts that Tony has towards other people in the mob, the ones that are really severe, that result in, him killing characters, those come out of a sense of deep pain that is not allowed by the family, right? The first example of this that I really saw that really made me take note was when Ralph ended up killing that girl that he was seeing, that young, I think 20-something, or maybe 18-year-old girl that he was seeing. Tony wasn't very familiar with this woman. It wasn't like she was his Gumar, right? But her and Tony have talked a little bit, and talking to her, Tony sees a lot of Meadow in her. And, without him realizing it, he becomes emotionally invested in her in a way that he shouldn't really be, right? In a way that, she's not his problem. And so when Ralph, ends up beating her and ultimately killing her, Tony has this big reaction. He's so upset. He's like, how the fuck could you do this? Why did you do that? He gets so upset with Ralph, right? I think he almost even kills Ralph over it. But everyone around him is like, dude, why do you care? She didn't mean anything to you. She wasn't your wife. She wasn't your daughter. She was nothing to you. She was just some whore. And I think for fans of The Soprano who see Tony as being this narcissistic, sociopath, psychopath, unfeeling, unempathetic kind of person, they see that outburst as being indicative of this deeper negative nature within Tony, right? But I actually think that the reason why Tony has this outburst in the way that he does in the first place is because he understands that it is not allowed within the mob family, right? If Ralph had done something to Carmela, right, Tony would have a path forward. And so even though he would be upset, he wouldn't act so impulsively because there is law, there's a kind of law in place within the realm of the world in which he lives that could lead to justice for him, right? But because of this situation, there is no path to justice. And so the only way that Tony can actually experience any kind of justice in that moment is to take matters into his own hands. And so the outburst becomes very violent. The same thing that happens with Pyomai, right? He goes to Ralph after what happened with Pyomai, and he starts to get the impression that Ralph really killed this horse for the insurance money. And, Ralph is like, why do you care? It was just a horse. And that's what makes Tony finally break and end up killing Ralph, right? Because Tony understands that it was just a horse. He knows that within the family, there is no path to justice or at the very least satisfaction on his side for what has happened. And so he must take matters into his own hands, and that is why he does what he does. And I don't think that you can say that someone who behaves in this way is someone who is, inherently does not respect the life and value of others. That he is someone who is, deep down, quite unempathetic and unfeeling and has no desire to connect with others. Tony, like everyone else, is trapped in this family. He is trapped in this life. And he knows that. He knows that better than y'all.